It's time for the Josh Kirby on Sports Podcast.
On this edition of the Kirby on Sports Podcast, we take a dive into college basketball, talk about our thoughts on the college basketball season so far, plus talking the NWSL with Marisa Pilla, along with some basketball standings, and so much more. But before we begin, as always, we would like to thank our sponsors, Regroup Building Services, PM Plus Reserves, Shenandoah Primitives, and Carlos Martinez with Chief Graphics. Big thanks, as always, to Dave Johnson and Productions by Quet for their support of the Kirby on Sports Podcast as well. It's time for yet another edition of the Kirby on Sports Podcast. It all comes your way right now.
I'm glad you connected. This is Dave Johnson, voice of the Washington Wizards. You have connected to the right place because you are listening to my man, Josh Kirby, on Sports Podcast.
All right. It's been way too long. Way too long. You know me. I am Josh Kirby. I am the host of this great podcast, the Kirby on Sports Podcast. I want to welcome you all back. We took a week off, and boy, we miss football still. I miss football. I don't know what to do with myself on Sundays. I turn it on Fox. I turn it on CBS, and there's no football. It's like, come on now. I mean, at least you got NASCAR if you're a NASCAR fan. But besides the point, we'll get rambling in a second. As always, we're sponsored by Regroup Building Services, PM Plus Reserves, Shenandoah Primitives, and Carlos Martinez with Chief Graphics. Hope you're doing well, Carlos. Big thanks, as always, to Dave Johnson and Productions by Quet for all their support as well. Riding with me after a short hiatus, a short week off, is my guy, Dan Demski. Dan, it's been a really long time. I'm sure you're missing football as much as me.
Oh, man, it is tough. And not just Sundays, Mondays, Thursdays, college football on Saturday. Man, it's a sad time for sure. It's hard to find sports to watch now that aren't postponed because of COVID. There's been a lot of college basketball, especially with my Virginia Tech Hokies recently, several of their games being postponed. They're finally back on tonight at 7, which is great to see. But other than that, man, it's been weird without football, and we see this coming every year, but that doesn't make it easier,
Yeah, I mean that's good. The Hokies are coming back. I mean, I guess we can just touch on that briefly. The Hokies have been looking very strong in the ACC so far. I mean, they've beaten teams. They beat Duke, for crying out loud. I mean, what do you see with this team moving forward after the short postponement with COVID and everything?
Well, they're getting into some of those mid-level ACC teams, which they always seem to struggle against. And in the past, I would be a little concerned. I think I still am a little bit concerned about them, just because they seem to play down to their competition a lot of times. That's like the Virginia Tech way in football and basketball, for that matter. But overall, I mean, I'm just impressed with what Mike Young's been able to do. Really build a young core of players, and they're really well rounded. I think their biggest weapon is, with a lot of teams, is the 3-pointer. I mean, they kind of live and die by the three, like a lot of professional college basketball teams do now. So, if they get that going, then they're going to be a successful team. now all the way through the ACC tournament, and they're definitely, right now they're an NCAA tournament team. So that'll mean they'll go to the bubble in Indianapolis in March. Don't know, things can change obviously between now and then. They could lose every game from here on out. I don't think that's going to happen, but they have an 11-8 Georgia Tech team tonight, and Georgia Tech's a sneaky team. They have, they're coming off a win against Miami. They lost to UVA by a few points back on February 10th, but they also beat a really good Florida State team and Clemson team too. So the ACC is interesting this year. We've seen the struggles of Duke and UNC, and that's really elevated teams even more like UVA, Florida State, Virginia Tech, teams that were good last year that are really getting more attention this year because UNC and Duke are not having good seasons in that conference.
I mean, you as a Tech fan and seeing the ACC and how strong the ACC has been in years past. I mean, obviously for me, I don't follow it as much as you do, but right. I mean, UNC and Duke are two storied franchises who always seem to make deep runs in March Madness and making it to the tournament. And for this year, seeing these two squads in Duke and UNC just struggle so bad. What are your thoughts when you see something like that?
It's really bizarre. Like, I really can't wrap my head around it. I think it was the first time since 1961, I think it's about 2 or 3 weeks ago, that Kentucky, UNC, and Duke were all not ranked in the top 25. It had been that long since those teams were not all ranked in the top 25 at that point in the season. So it's really strange. Like, UNC is they're a decent team right now, but just that gap between the top 3 teams and then you go down to UNC, it's really strange, for sure, to see that they're not as successful as they are. But look, they're a team that could be very dangerous in the ACC tournament, and honestly, I wouldn't even put them out of the NCAA tournament right now as far as a team that's dangerous. Duke has been, I think, similar to Kentucky. They're just a very young team, obviously, still trying to find their identity, I think, in a lot of ways. But it definitely is strange. I think the Big 12 and obviously the Big 10 are really, really good conferences this year. The Big East always has a couple teams in there. So this is really an interesting season because we don't see the same powerhouses as we normally do. That could cause, some attention come tournament time.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at the standings here, obviously some of the records are sort of funky due to game postponements and stuff, but you have Florida State, Virginia, and Virginia Tech in that top 3 spot. Then you have North Carolina, Louisville, and Duke. Then after that, Clemson, Syracuse, and Georgia Tech. NC State, Notre Dame, Pitt, Wake Forest, Miami, and Boston College in last. So, I mean,
and even the top 25 this year, you have Gonzaga at number 1. They have been just a dominating team. You got Baylor at number 2. Baylor's not really known for their basketball prowess, as they're more known for football. In really the last decade. Michigan at number 3, they're always a really solid basketball team. They're usually ranked very, very well in the top 10. Ohio State at 4, Illinois at 5. So, I mean, just right there, you have 3 Big 10 teams in the top 5. That's a really tough conference. And again, it's hard to compare these teams when they haven't played the same amount of games, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So really, I think these conference tournaments and then, of course, the NCAA tournaments, as they always are, will be very telling. And also, I think we're just excited that we're going to see the NCAA tournament this year because, if you recall, that's kind of when things started with COVID last year, right before the NCAA tournament was supposed to happen. We started to see things shut down, and then we've been in this situation ever since. So, yeah, it's definitely an interesting time. I think West Virginia is a good team at 10. I've seen some of their games. I'm not the biggest fan of West Virginia for obvious reasons, but they have a really solid program. You have Iowa at number 9. They've been an interesting team to watch, and of course, Villanova always up there. They're at number 8. Just well-rounded, I think, this year. Usually it's Kentucky, UNC, Duke are the teams every year that everyone talks about. But they've really been hit by, I think those younger teams have been hit by COVID differently. I think it's just a lot harder to take a guy coming out of high school with limited off-season preparation and just kind of throw him into the season and say, there you go for it. So I think that's where those teams have suffered. But, it is strange not seeing UNC, Duke, and Kentucky up there. So I think it's better for college basketball. I think it's better for athletics because it gives other teams a chance to to win some tournament games and maybe make a surprise Cinderella run. And I think this could be the year where we could see something like that because of just how weird the season has been in general.
Speaking of surprise Cinderella run, out of the America East Conference at 14-5, you have the UMBC Retrievers. Oh yeah.
We all know UVA doesn't want to play them again.
That would be hilarious if that happened and they beat them for a second time. But I mean, to wrap up this sort of segment here, I mean, I think the NCAA tournament's going to be really different because it's not spread out. It's just all in one location in Indianapolis.
Right.
So that's obviously going to help things. You said it was in a bubble, right?
Yeah. I don't know the specifics right now, but I've heard they're planning on doing a bubble system in Indianapolis. I don't know if they're going to play at one location, if they're going to have, Indianapolis is not a big city, so I can't imagine that outside of Lucas Oil Stadium they have many, large-scale multi-purpose areas that they could turn into basketball courts. But you never know, I guess. But that'll be interesting, too, because then we'll see more teams get into more of a routine, not having to travel across the country or whatnot, depending on what bracket they're in and where they have to go. So that just adds another layer to this whole thing. So,
oh yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I'm worried about what if something happens if they don't have enough time to get people up there. I'm sure they will, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, what if somebody tests positive and pops the bubble or something like that? Then they could compromise it.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's in a bubble, but there's so many factors, but I'm just glad we're going to have a March Madness after last year not having one.
I think that's true, but I think you're going to see the NCAA really be very strict on what these players can and can't do inside the bubble. And we saw the NBA do a bubble last year, and it went pretty well. You really didn't have too many outbreaks. Players really did what they were supposed to do. Baseball, obviously, they had a few more issues, especially at the beginning of the season where we just didn't know if they were going to even be able to finish after the Marlins had about, a dozen plus players test positive, and then the tests kept going, and they end up having just an unreal season, making the postseason. And, I think in general, we're going to see, the expectations of how severe this virus are now are well known for everyone involved. And these players are going to know going into this, look, these are going to be very strict protocol situations. If we break protocol, I guess in a way they could say you're kicked out of the tournament if it's if it's one or two players on a team or whatever. So I don't know the specifics of how the NCAA is going to handle it, but look, Josh, they lost a lot of money last year.
Absolutely.
Canceling the NCAA tournament. They were out millions and millions of dollars, not just in ticket revenue and things like that, but TV contracts. I mean, gosh, they Turner Broadcasting has all the NCAA tournament games, and I'm sure they lost a decent amount of money too. So it's at the end of the day, that's really what capitalism is about, man. It's about the money. So the NCAA's can do everything in their power to make this work, and to make sure that players are focused on the protocols and they do what they have to do.
I mean, ending my thoughts of this, I'm very glad it's coming back. But back to your point on the revenue and stuff, I think that's why other sports leagues just had to tough it out through the outbreaks and reschedule games. Because if they were to postpone their season or pause the season, they're not getting money. So I think that's one of the main reasons why the NFL, the NBA, which we'll get into a little bit later, touch on, and the NHL, who have all had outbreaks, sort of stick through it. And
and I think the key is really just outbreaks on their own teams, and especially in the NBA and what's the other one you said? Major League Baseball.
Yep.
Yeah, they mainly just had outbreaks on their own teams. Luckily, you didn't see 2 or 3 teams at once with a big outbreak. Now, in the NFL this year, several teams had outbreaks. You had 3 or 4 teams, especially, my Baltimore Ravens, who had an insane outbreak. The worst I think any team had this year. Why they kept that coach still boggles the mind. But
we'll never know.
We'll never know. Maybe they'll do something in the offseason. Who knows? But I think that was the key, was they were able to kind of keep it as contained as possible. And when players like, for example, Dwayne Haskins, do what they do during COVID out at a fun time bar.
Oh, you must love the Dwayne Haskins signing to Pittsburgh then.
Oh my God, it's fantastic. I love it. I absolutely love it. It's sort of a smart move because it gives him a second chance, but it also is a low risk, possible high reward for Pittsburgh if things work out. So, but going back to what I said, I think there is adamant concern for COVID, outbreaks, especially within a bubble. But the NCAA has seen how the NBA did it. The NBA did a fantastic job. I thought, with how they handled it. There's going to be strict testing every day, I imagine. There's going to be strict protocols enforced. And look, depending on how vaccines go, they may be able to get more players vaccinated. It just depends on, there's so many different variables. We just don't know. It's likely not going to happen between now and the end of March when the tournament's over, but there's a lot to consider here, and I'm sure the NCAA has done their research. They know how these other sports leagues made it work, and they know what's at stake here, and they definitely know that fans want to see this tournament go on without a hitch, and even if there are a couple COVID tests, they're going to find a way to contact trace, get the appropriate players quarantined, and go from there. You may be missing your star player in the Sweet 16, but, sometimes that's in COVID. If you want to have a big NCAA tournament, that's just how it is,
It's really, really, really going to be interesting to see. And we'll have it all covered right here. The March Madness. I'm sure we'll have a nice little bracketology episode on the podcast. So looking forward to that. But it's going to be really, really fun. As we are recording today, news broke that Tiger Woods was in a car accident. He has been hospitalized and has been in surgery. I've read reports. I'm not really sure why the crash happened. It was a single car crash. No others involved besides Tiger Woods. Yeah. Apparently he's alive. He's doing all right. From what I know, I'm not sure if you heard anything different, Dan, but obviously some serious concern for Tiger Woods. One, his well-being, making sure he is all right and he survives. But I mean, long-term picture, could this be a career-ending sort of thing for Tiger Woods?
I'll touch on the accident itself from what I've heard, and I've heard several different reports and read a couple different things. They think speed was a factor in the crash. Apparently, the road he crashed on is a little windy there in Los Angeles, and there's a lot of suspicions that he was taking the curves a little fast and lost control, and probably overcorrected like so many people do in situations like that, which is just human nature, and it's crazy, man. Obviously, I don't know if you saw the picture of his SUV, but the front end was absolutely destroyed. So
Oh my gosh.
you're really thankful that he survived it, and it looks like he will survive it. But obviously, what your second question, that is the question I think we're all asking, because when you hear that he has not only leg injuries, but they say severe leg injuries where he could have possible long-term recovery. This is a guy that's had how many knee and hip injuries and issues with those areas in his career. It kind of derailed his comeback a couple times. So it's really just a lot of questions right now, and I don't it's only time will tell when we get the answers. But it's interesting because one of the other things they reported was that they don't think that alcohol or drugs were involved in the crash, but that's definitely something that's going to have to be he's going to have to be tested, and they're going to have to do a toxicology report, because that's an important issue here too. And as you pull up right now, I mean, he had a car crash in 2009.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this isn't the first time. I remember Tiger Woods getting into some sort of trouble. I believe this 2009 car crash. He was arguing with his wife. I mean, I don't remember the specifics off the top of my head, but I know he was involved in. I don't want to speak 100%, but I think there was something about alcohol involved or something. But I mean,
Yeah, I think you're right.
Hearing this, I'm like, this isn't the first time this has happened, and I was sort of baffled. But I mean, TMZ reported Tiger Woods badly injured in car crash, seen speeding from a hotel minutes before the accident. So
yeah, I think in
I'm
my
not really,
mind,
I'm
I
not
had-
really sure if there's like a
sorry.
backstory to why this crash happened, like there was in 2009. But I mean, in the back of my mind, there's sort of like suspicion. But obviously, I wish Tiger all the best, nonetheless. And I hope he pulls through this, because regardless, he is one of the best golfers to ever play the game.
Well, here we go. I got some more information here. This was at 6:30. The L.A. County Sheriff Alex Villanueva held a press conference. They do believe speed was involved with the crash. It was a downhill road with several slopes and curves, so kind of like I originally thought. I mean, I had seen, and of course, you see stuff on social media and things like that, and you take it with a grain of salt, because you just don't know how true it all is.
Yeah.
But I'd seen that he was late for something, possibly like he was going to do. I don't know if it was a media event or something with. Apparently, Drew Brees was involved somehow with whatever he was supposed to event he was supposed to go to today.
Ooh, interesting.
I had seen that. I don't know how true that is. I don't see it anywhere here in this CNN article. But it's crazy, because this is a guy who has really had a second wind in his career. Obviously, with his comeback a few years ago, ever since his leaving his wife, his scandal, things like that, he's been trying to make amends in his career.
Mm-hmm.
This would be just a horrible way for this all to end, I think. if this indeed is the end of his career, which certainly, it's not. It's more likely than not, I think, right now that it could be a career ender. I mean, if you look at his age, his level of play in the last couple years is not the same as it was. Obviously, that happens with age anyway. Here we go. This is 32 minutes ago. Let me pull this up here. This is courtesy of Daniel Miller. He is a reporter for the LA Times. He says his injuries included a shattered ankle and 2 leg fractures, one of which was compound, according to a source familiar with his treatment. Quote, lucky to be alive, quote, end quote, the LA County Sheriff says. So that's the LA Times.
Obviously, I don't want to speculate, but I just hope Tiger is all right, and because this sucks to hear. Because just a little bit over a year ago, we heard about a athlete, Kobe Bryant, tragically losing his life, and story could have told that Tiger Woods probably could have lost his life, but fate had a different story for him. But still, I saw on the news and I was like, gosh, I'm glad he's all right, because this could have been another whole sort of Kobe thing. I mean, I don't want to compare Kobe and Tiger Woods, but still, I mean, they're two great athletes.
Yeah, my mind immediately went to that too. It's funny you should say that. When I saw breaking news, Tiger Woods, I'm like, oh my God, what happened? Is this because it just it like you said, it brought back a flashback of just a year ago. I guess a year and a month or so ago now, when we got that tragic news, and I was like, oh man, this can't be real. But I saw he was in an accident. And I've just been thinking about it, honestly. It's awful. I mean, it really is awful that this happened. And, obviously there'll be a big investigation into this. We'll find out more information later on. We're going to find out sooner than later whether alcohol or drugs were involved. They said at the time of the crash, and really ever since, they've said that they don't believe it was a cause of the crash. It just looks like he was in a hurry. He was driving fast and sort of erratically. But, when someone drives erratically, that's where your mind immediately goes to, they were under the influence of some sort of substance. So only time will tell. It's just crazy. Our thoughts and prayers, of course, go out to he and his family. He's looks like he's going to be okay as far as his life is concerned. I think I saw that he was wearing a seatbelt, which is such a testament to the safety of cars, of seatbelts in general. What they're designed to do is, not, if he was ejected, I just don't know if there's any way he survives a crash like that, just looking at the total damage of his SUV. So, yeah, it's insanity, and we're gonna find out about the long term. I think, in the coming days, he's gonna have a statement released, and we're gonna find out more information about his side of it, and if he plans to, go into rehab and come back and whatnot, we're gonna hear that in the next few days too. So this is still a developing story, of course.
Yeah, developing story indeed. We'll keep you updated, Kirby, on sports on Twitter, and once again, thoughts and prayers out to Tiger Woods and his family. It's very tragic to hear what has happened. Once again, I'm Josh, rolling with Dan on the Kirby on Sports podcast. So much more to come, so stick with us right after this. I'd like to take a moment to talk about my friends over at Regroup Building Services, specializing in custom homes, remodels, additions, and so much more. If you're looking for a new place to call home or just need repairs on your current one, look no further because Regroup Building Services has you covered. Just a couple months ago, Regroup Building Services came in and redid our entire kitchen, and boy, does it look great. I cannot recommend them enough. So if you're looking for anything to be done, make sure you check them out at www.regroupbuildingservices.com. Once again, that's www.regroupbuildingservices.com, where they do the honeydews that your honey don't. Make sure you tell them Josh sent you. All right, welcome back. Josh, along with Dan Demski, once again on the Kirby on Sports podcast, talking now about the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League, one of the biggest growing sports. In my opinion, I've seen a lot of highlights. It was a sport that I didn't really know much about, and I kept seeing more and more, and I had the opportunity to interview Marisa Pilla of the Pilla Talk podcast discussing the NWSL. She's a sideline reporter for CBS covering the NWSL, and she was actually in the NWSL bubble in Utah as they were playing. The NWSL was one of the first sports to come back from this pandemic and successfully initiate a bubble. So this is a really great interview about the NWSL. So without further ado, my interview with Marisa Pilla of the Pilla Talk podcast. All right, welcome back to the Kirby on Sports podcast. I'm pleased to be joined now by the host of the Pilla Talk podcast and also a sideline reporter for the MLS and NWSL, Marisa Pilla. Marisa,
Hi.
Thanks for carving out some time. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. We're glad to have you on. So first and foremost, with this pandemic, I'm sure things have been rocky, way you've been doing your job. So can you tell us a little bit about how you've been affected by COVID so far?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest hit definitely came, of course, when it hit everybody last March for real, because that's really the start of MLS, usually early March. And I actually was out in Portland for opening weekend last weekend, covering it for Fox Sports. And it's a huge event out in Portland. It is sellout crowds. These crowds wait around the stadium all day to get inside. So it's a great atmosphere. And I was really happy to be there for opening weekend since it's a really hot ticket. It was a great game, ended up being really exciting between them and Minnesota United. The following weekend, I covered a U.S. women's national team game up in New Jersey, and I had all these things on my books, and all of a sudden everything stopped. And especially in soccer season, that's my busy season for work. So I really didn't know what was going to happen. It was like everything was canceled. I also cover Ivy League basketball. That was the first thing that got canceled. So everything was up in the air. But what was really great was the NWSL was able to really rally, and they put together an incredible tournament. They were the first league to really do a bubble, and they were actually the first American team sport back in action since the pandemic started. So we went out to Utah for a month starting in late June. I got back late July. We lived in suburban Utah for an entire month. We didn't see anyone outside of whoever was playing in the games and whoever was working the games. And we had 0 COVID cases out there. We were tested every couple days. And it was a really successful tournament viewership-wise, too. It was the first year NWSL was on CBS Sports, and the final got over 680,000 viewers, which is huge. It's one of the highest rating women's soccer games besides a national team ever. So it was really, really great to see the league be able to operate under such strenuous circumstances and really excel.
Well, I mean, that's half the stuff on my note sheet that I don't have to discuss now, because I thought that was really interesting, because the NWSL, let's just hop right into it.
Sure.
This was the first league that came back for this pandemic. And do you know if they were like the first team that implemented the bubble, that did this whole bubble format?
I'm not sure, but I think at the time, if I remember correctly, there were talks about like NHL and NBA getting back into the swing, and they were kind of throwing the word around bubble. But I think at the time, no one really knew what that meant or what it was going to look like. So when I got the phone call that said, hey, would you be interested in going out to Utah and living in this bubble? I was like, sure, but not really knowing what to expect. And you there's no way to prepare yourself for that kind of environment. So I'm not sure if they're the first one who really thought about it or created it. Because I know it was getting kicked around a bit, but they're definitely the first ones to have implemented it, and they implemented it with a lot of success.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, 0 COVID cases. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like living in the bubble covering the teams?
Yeah, it was a lot, I have to say, because the schedule was pretty strenuous. And what's interesting is it was a tournament format, which isn't always the case in regular season soccer. These teams hardly ever play in a tournament. And for these athletes, if you're not on a national team, US or otherwise, you probably haven't played in a tournament since maybe your college or youth travel team days. So for a lot of players, this was a big awakening into physically and mentally how demanding a tournament can be, because this is not a typical setup other than World Cups and Olympics. And of course, we know only a select amount of players get to play in those big tournaments. So it was hard for the athletes to adjust. But what our schedule was let's say we had games Monday and Tuesday, but we had double headers. So we had 2 games on Monday, 2 games on Tuesday. We'd have Wednesday, Thursday off, 2 games on Friday, 2 games on Saturday, Sunday off, and then start all over again. So there was a lot of games in a short amount of time. That coupled with being isolated from everyone, it just made me super hyper focused. And when I say isolated, I lived in an apartment across the street from one of the stadiums they were playing at. And if I wasn't at the game, I was in my apartment, and that's it. I didn't go anywhere. I didn't explore. I didn't go to restaurants because I didn't want to be the person who popped the bubble because we were getting tested every couple of days. So I know the staff, I can only speak to our protocol. I think the teams were similar, but we got tested maybe every 3 days, continually tested. Everybody always wore masks. Everybody was very stringent on hand washing and hand sanitizing. My sideline reports and interviews were a little bizarre at first because normally I'm used to at halftime running out onto the field and grabbing the player I need and holding them close to talk to them. This time I had to wait on the sideline. Somebody had to wave them over, and then they had to stand 6 feet away from me, which was difficult. So I definitely had to adjust a lot of different aspects, kind of working within a bubble.
So the NWSL, one of the more rising leagues. I've heard a lot of stuff about how exciting this league is and stuff with 10 teams. In a normal normal world with no COVID, tell us a little bit about the NWSL and how it's usually formatted as compared to other leagues like the MLS. Is it the same kind of format, or do they do something different?
It's pretty much the same. So what's great about NWSL is this is the longest running professional women's league in this country. And they very much pride themselves on being the most competitive women's league in the world. So while there are women's professional leagues in Australia or in Europe, the competition and the talent across the board in the NWSL is far superior. While you may have in England a couple really talented teams, in NWSL, the talent's more spread out, and there's a lot of great talent. So that's really great. It's entering its 9th season this year, which is fantastic because it's 1 away from 10, and that's a landmark year for women's soccer. There's been previous leagues that operated, women's leagues that operated in the country, and none of them had been as successful as the NWSL. And I think, too, what's really important is this sustained success we're going to see in the next couple of years, because this year, as you said, there's 10 teams. Well, in years prior, there was only 9. So we just had a 10th team join, which is Racing Louisville. They had their expansion draft in the fall. And then next year, we have 2 more teams joining. We have LA, Angel City, which is out of LA, and then a Sacramento team will be joining. I don't think in 2022, maybe 2023, but over the next few years, this league is growing and people are really, really trying to buy ownership in this league. We just saw tennis champ Naomi Osaka buy a piece of ownership of North Carolina Courage. Serena Williams owns a piece of ownership of Angel City, along with Natalie Portman, Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, a lot of big names. So the NWSL is a really great league that, as you said, is on the rise. It's growing. There are a lot of eyeballs on the league right now. But format-wise, if you're a regular soccer fan who enjoys MLS or you enjoy Premier League, you're going to love NWSL because it's the exact same format. Normally, it is a regular season, no COVID year. It's a regular season starting in April, running through November, which really kind of coincides with MLS. But last year, as I said, it started with a Challenge Cup and it finished with a fall series. And what's going to happen this year is it's again going to start with a Challenge Cup. So it's going to start with a tournament for the first month. After that month, the regular season will continue. But it seems like a lot of the players and the teams liked having that tournament feature. So I think they opted into bringing that back this year.
So is the Challenge Cup, can you dive more in depth about the Challenge Cup and what does that do to lead into the regular season? I'm sort of confused by that.
Yeah. So we were all kind of confused last year. Like, okay, well, if somebody wins the Challenge Cup, do they win the league? Like, well, if they're what if they hit a really big milestone for goals in the Challenge Cup? Does that count towards their career stats? So from my understanding, the Challenge Cup kind of operates within its own world. It's the Challenge Cup. So if you win the Challenge Cup, that's it. You just win the Challenge Cup. You're not the league winner for the year. So I think what teams liked about the Challenge Cup was because there were so many games in succession and because you had that quick turnover, it really made your team kind of hit the ground running as soon as the season started. So I think they liked that format in the beginning. So from my understanding, in this season, Challenge Cup will start mid-April and it'll run about a month. And then I believe there might be one weekend off. The schedule's not released yet. And then the regular season will continue. So this year there will be a winner from the Challenge Cup and then a regular season winner, which if anyone's a soccer fan, they win the NWSL Shield, the best record in the league. And then there's the playoffs. So you can win the Challenge Cup, you can win the standings, and then you can win the league championship. So there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of things going on, but I think it makes it exciting to see if somebody had success in a tournament, can they sustain that for a regular season when it's, the games are a little more progressed and vice versa. So it makes it all a little more interesting.
The one thought that popped into my head after you said it's like a big tournament at the beginning of the year. It just popped in my head, NASCAR and the Daytona 500. It's like one of the biggest hyped races of the year, but I mean, it's just a race. You still have the rest of the season to go to win a championship.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like shooting yourselves out of the cannon at the beginning of the season, getting all these games in, and having to rotate your squad a lot. And I think that's what a lot of coaches liked as well, is they got to see a lot more depth out of their team, because some teams, like North Carolina Courage, for example, they have a lot of talented players. They, on paper, as of maybe a couple years, even last year, they were probably the most talented team on paper. So for younger players to get minutes with them is not really common. And then they don't get those opportunities to grow in their game. So a tournament gives you that chance to really rotate through a lot of players and get them minutes in times when you might not be able to over the stretch of a season. So I think that's what coaches enjoy too, but it makes a lot of people shine in those moments. We saw some names really come to the forefront of the league during the Challenge Cup that were like, oh, wow, I'm glad this person is finally hitting their stride. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out this year.
So could you see potentially they lobby to keep this format in years to come?
I think we'll have to see how this year goes. I was a little surprised to see, pleasantly surprised to see it come back this year. Just because I wasn't expecting it to. Now, I don't know if it came back because of COVID protocols and they thought this was the best way to start things off while everything is still kind of touch and go. And I don't know how much of it was that the players enjoyed it, the coaches enjoyed it. I'm not sure how much what exactly went into that thought. Maybe if this year goes well again and the teams still enjoy that kind of format, it can become something that becomes part of the league. I think I'd have to say for sure maybe after this season.
Let me ask you something. As you're a sideline reporter for the NWSL, can you give the audience sort of one of your favorite memories, one of the best plays you've seen, something like that?
Sure. I mean, I get to see and hear a lot on the sidelines, and that's pretty much my favorite part of the job. But there's sometimes where there's just spectacular goals. There was one moment in the Challenge Cup. I believe it was Washington Spirit, and I forget who they were playing, but it was really late in the game. Washington Spirit was down 1-0. They were trying to salvage a point because if you tie, you get 1 point in soccer. And they were trying to salvage just getting something. And they had been knocking on the door all night. So many attempts, everything was getting blocked. And finally it was a corner kick. And somebody sends in a nice in-swinging corner. And this rookie, Ashley Sanchez, somehow reached her leg behind her head in like a scorpion kick, got a piece of the ball just off a ricochet, like it wasn't even placed to her, and she scored the game tying goal. Wow. And it was just one of those moments where you're like, that can never happen again. I don't think she could do it again if she tried. So that was a really cool moment too, because she was a rookie and she was able to just really put herself out there and make herself a really viable candidate for her team.
So covering the sport, do you see it continuing to grow for years and years and years to come?
Oh, for sure. Especially the women's game. Because every 4 years, everybody gets so excited about the World Cup and the Women's World Cup because the national team is so talented and they're the best national team in the league, probably ever to exist. But what's important is sustaining that interest in women's soccer, because these players are playing not every 4 years, they're playing every year, every season. And it's not just these national team members, it's really talented players who maybe are just on the cusp or play for other national teams. But what was really great is I believe it was a 500% increase in audience for NWSL this year on TV. Wow. So that's great because not only were they the first ones to come back, nothing else was on. So you had to watch NWSL in the summer if you wanted to watch live sports. So it did really well because the games are super exciting. There's a lot of great players that are both household names, but also who are becoming household names. And that's really interesting. But I see nothing but a rise for this league and the game in general.
Once again, Marisa Pilla with the Pilla Talk podcast here on the Kirby on Sports podcast. Great insight from the NWSL, but I'd also like to get into the Pilla Talk podcast. How's that going so far for you?
It's been a lot of fun. I know we were talking before we started this, and I started it with no expectations, just as something for it to be fun for me. Because as a sideline reporter, I don't have a lot of time to get my hits in. I'm really cut off at like 10 to 15 seconds. I really have to be very concise and very smart with the words I use in my reports. I have to give you the most information with the least amount of words every single time, especially in soccer, because there's no natural breaks or timeouts. So I started to realize, wow, I have all these great connections. I know all these great stories of players around the league and other athletes. I'd love a platform to share them. So that's when I thought maybe I'd start my own podcast. So that's kind of what Pilla Talk is. It's just sit down interviews with some really interesting people, both in soccer and outside of soccer. Just an opportunity to really dive deeper in stories that I think are worth sharing.
I was talking to a friend of mine and I was like, I'm going to interview you such and such of the Pilla Talk podcast. He was like, wow, that's a legendary name right there.
Everyone loves the name. I'm glad. So at least if they don't even listen to the podcast, they like the name. It's intriguing enough.
Yeah. It's also crazy. I forgot to even touch on a sideline reporter in soccer because there are no breaks. It's like a continuous 90-minute game. Regardless with the halftime in between, but still that must be very difficult sometimes because then when you're reporting, there could be like an amazing goal that happens or something.
Yeah. So you always have to have your head, you have to be looking at the field. So even if you have notes, you have to kind of hold them up a little bit higher just so you can refer to your notes, but also watch the action. Because the last thing you want to do is to be talking while someone is taking the ball inside the 18 and winding up to take an amazing shot, because you do not want to ruin that goal call. You don't want to ruin that moment. So you have to be very aware of what's going on. And great producers help with that too, understanding the timing of the game. Usually a lot of goal kicks is when I get in, maybe some throw-ins, substitutions, kind of those little pauses. And what was nice about the Challenge Cup was there was hydration breaks. which happens when games get to a certain temperature. FIFA instills a hydration break. So they're 3-minute breaks for the teams to get water because it's so hot. So we were in Utah in the middle of summer and it was beyond hot. So there's hydration breaks and that's a good time to get in. But normally it's not like a football game or a basketball game or anything like that where there's natural pauses. You just have to kind of understand the flow of the action and know when to pitch your story and also be aware of what might happen so you can kind of be a seamless broadcast.
I mean, this insight I love because stuff like this really interests me. So I want to ask you, I know you've covered Ivy League basketball as well, along with any other sports you might have been a sideline reporter for. Which one do you think is the hardest to cover?
I think they're all difficult for a multitude of reasons. I think soccer just on the sidelines is a little more difficult, like I said, than the football or college basketball. Also because there's no huddles, like there's no team huddles where like in basketball, I can kind of sneak behind a bench and let a assistant coach know like, hey, I'm part of the broadcast. I'm here just to get insight. So like, I'm not some creeper just kind of hopping into their huddle. But that's really helpful too, to be able to really hear, because basketball, you're so confined and you can really hear everything and you can see where the coach is pointing, where soccer, coaches tend to just naturally be a little more subdued and a little more cerebral. So it's not so much of, I heard him tell this player this, it's really having to listen and ask questions and really get into it down there. So I think soccer might be pretty, compared to football or basketball, might be a little more difficult, I'd say.
Absolutely. Once again, Marisa Pilla with the Pilla Talk podcast. Marisa, before we let you go, let the fans know how to find your podcast.
Sure. You can find Pilla Talk podcast on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. I think we're on Google Play. It's on everything. So just Google it. And then, you can find, I also have a podcast Instagram called Pilla Talk Podcast, a podcast Twitter called Pilla Talk Pod. And you can also follow me on Instagram at Marisa_Pilla.
Absolutely. Marisa, we greatly appreciate your time with us today. This is the Kirby on Sports podcast. We will be right back right after this. For sports fans living in condominium and homeowners associations, as well as business professionals, when you need a reserve study, PM Plus Reserves has been in business since 1990. Their studies are accurate and easy to understand. Check them out when your association needs a study. www.pmplusreserves.com. You can also contact them at 703-803-8436. Once again, www.pmplusreserves.com. All right, welcome back. I'm Josh. Riding along with me on the Kirby on Sports podcast is Dan Demski. Big thanks to Marisa Pilla of the Pilla Talk podcast for coming on the podcast as well. Really great interview by her. Really appreciate the time once again. So, Dan, welcome back. Let's discuss some NBA, sir. I know we don't really follow the NBA during our heavy football season, but a lot has been going on. And let's just roll through the standings here really quick. In the Eastern Conference, you have the 76ers. This is a team who has really improved over the past couple of years, because the 76ers were down there as one of the worst teams in the NBA a couple years ago. Then you have the Brooklyn Nets. James Harden just got traded to the Brooklyn Nets. They have a lot of great assets. They have Kyrie Irving and stuff like players like that. But that big James Harden trade, the Nets got rid of pretty much everybody. So they don't really have a bench, if you know what I mean. Then you have the Milwaukee Bucks, the 3 seed, the Pacers, the 4 seed, the Toronto Raptors, the 5 seed, the Celtics, the 6, the Knicks in the 7th seed, and the Chicago Bulls in the 8th seed. Then, as of right now, if the playoffs were to start today, that would be your 1 through 8 seed. Then you have Ninth in the Eastern Conference, Charlotte. 10th, the Miami Heat. The Atlanta Hawks in 11th. Orlando in 12th. Washington in 13th. Cleveland in 14th. And Detroit in 15th. Crazy thing is, last night, the Wizards extended their win streak and beat the Los Angeles Lakers in overtime. I mean, being a DC homer and everything, but still, I was very surprised that Washington pulled out this win over the Lakers. Out of everybody, the Los Angeles Lakers and LeBron James.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to win every game, right?
Yeah.
You know, they're going to slip up every now and then. But yeah, it was a good team effort. I think just what we've seen from the Wizards this year is just they haven't been able to mesh very well with Russell Westbrook. I think he's a great player, but it's going to take time for them to figure out each other's playing styles, and especially he and Beal playing together, two extremely talented players. But I think looking at the East in general, I think my overall broad comment is just how close, how really up for grabs, the 4th through the 8th seed in the playoffs are. We have so many teams that are right there on the bubble. And really, 14 of the 15 teams, right now could easily compete for a playoff spot or within 3 or 4 games of that playoff spot. So Cleveland or Detroit's got a little bit more work to do than the rest of those teams, but even statistically, they're still technically in it. So all of these teams are relatively close. And I think, like we often hear, the East is a lot weaker, especially in the middle tier teams. And the standings this year so far have kind of proven that, I think. There's been a lot of, no team has really pulled away outside of Philadelphia, Brooklyn, and Milwaukee. The other teams really have not been as impressive, I think, as you would like to see.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. And I still feel like it's still early in the NBA season and a lot can happen before the playoffs actually start. So
sure, you got 50 games to go still. So.
Yeah. I mean, there's still a lot of season left to be played. So I mean, the East obviously is weaker. I think, in my opinion, the West is the more stronger conference.
Oh, absolutely, no doubt.
In my opinion, because you have the Lakers, you have the Spurs, the Jazz. Where the Jazz comes from, I mean.
Yeah,
the Jazz have been looking incredible with the 25-6 record. You have the Clippers. You have the Suns, who are finally looking good. Mm-hmm. All these teams in the West. But, I mean, the East, like you said, the 4 through 8 is pretty much a toss-up. But still, there's a lot more left to be played in the season to determine who will possibly make it into the playoffs. But obviously, we're seeing a lot of great basketball right now.
Yeah, we are. We're seeing a lot of, as you mentioned, we're seeing upsets and stuff. And I think that's going to happen over a long, extended season like the NBA has. It's one of those professional leagues where you expect to see more upsets, I think, in the long haul of a regular season than you would in the NFL or I guess Major League Baseball. You expect to see upsets too, because obviously, similarly, these teams play each other a lot during the season. So these things happen. But yeah, I think in general, it's in the East, we've really seen Brooklyn just reload this year. Of course, with getting James Harden now, they've become a really powerful team. Philly has become a complete rebuild. I remember when #TrustTheProcess was really big for them. Like you said, 3 or 4 years ago, they were, drafting guys like Ben Simmons and trying to build a young team, and they've been extremely successful. I mean, they're 13-2 at home this year, so I know playing at home court really doesn't matter during times of COVID, but they are a really good basketball team. Of course, the Bucks, they've been up there in the top seeds in the East for the last 3 or 4 seasons. Not really surprised to see them up there. And then if you go to the West, I just think the West is just absolutely loaded. Like you said, of course, the Jazz and Clippers and Lakers right on their heels. We all know how talented the Lakers are. It's nice to see the Suns up there, Josh, at the 4th seed in the West. And it's nice to see San Antonio, I think, still hanging around there at the 6th seed with Greg Popovich. He's a well-coached basketball team. They always have been, and they've always been in the hunt. So it's looking good so far. I like how the season's played out. We've seen a lot of surprises, like you said, most notably with your Wizards taking down the Lakers last night, which, as I mentioned, these things happen. And I know you said before the broadcast that you don't expect them to make the playoffs. I really don't. I don't give them a high percentage to make it, but it's definitely not out of the question right now. I mean, they have 4 or 5 more straight wins. The Wizards have 5 straight wins. If they put together 4 or 5 more wins, they get it up to 10 wins in a row. All of a sudden, they're either right on the outside of that playoff picture at the 9 seed, or they're back in the 8th seed. So the NBA season is a long haul, and it's all about when you find your stride and when you start to work together. And in these last 5 games, the Wizards have been doing it. They've been putting it all together.
Yeah, they're like a game and a half out of a playoff spot or something. I heard they're 11-17 and the Bulls are 14-16. That's very close. I mean, obviously, like I said earlier, there's a lot of basketball left to be played, but it's theirs for the taking if they want it. Because right at the beginning of this NBA season, which we didn't really cover due to the NFL season, I knew for a fact this Wizards team, this was Scott Brooks' last opportunity to prove himself, and then he would be gone. And the Wizards off to a rocky start, and they're coming back, and they have a chance. And looking better, playing better, meshing well together. I think the meshing well together is the biggest part.
Yeah.
Hands down, 100%.
I mean, absolutely. That's what everyone has been saying all along. It was all about when Russell Westbrook got to that team. We all know how talented Russell Westbrook and Bradley Beal are. But the big questions, obviously, were can they mesh and can they work together as a team? And, so far, I would say they've been able to do a pretty decent job. They've had their moments now and then, but they're really starting to figure it out now. And I think this is the moment where, hopefully for them, it all starts to work. And they start to, they've already strung together 5 straight wins, and it feels like there's a momentum shift coming there. And with the Eastern Conference, so, those playoff spots at the edge so up for grabs, I don't count the Wizards out. I really don't. I think I'm not going to say they're going to go out and not lose another game, because obviously that'd be goofy, but don't count them out. They could be a team that slips into the playoffs and could be a tricky team to play come playoff time.
Yeah, absolutely. But looking at the West, do we think we could see LeBron James and the Lakers potentially repeat, go back to the finals, and potentially win it again? I know there's still a lot of basketball left, but could you see that happening?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not only are you looking at a dominant team with a lot of stars, you're looking at a team with playoff and championship experience already, so that gives them an edge over a team like the Clippers and a team like Utah, who really, in recent memory, has not had much success in the postseason in the NBA. So, that alone gives the Lakers an edge. However they end up in the playoffs, whether they stay at the 3rd seed, I do think the Lakers will end up winning the Western Conference. And obviously will be the team to beat come playoff time. And anytime you're the defending champs, that talk is always strong, no matter if you're having a great season or you're having a down season, over whether you can repeat. And I really do think the Lakers are one of those unique situations where I really believe they could repeat. And I don't see right now at least a team in the East that I think could beat them in a 7-game series. You know, if it's one game, then maybe, because teams have bad games. But in a 7-game series, the best team, the most grinded out sort of team, comes out on top. And I think that's what the Lakers are. They're the best grinded out, best basketball team with the greatest basketball player in the world on their team. So that definitely plays a big role too.
Absolutely. Well, once again, that's sort of a brief overview of the NBA standings as we are recording. Once again, I'm Josh. Rolling with me, Dan, on the Kirby on Sports podcast. We're going to throw it to another quick break. When we return, we will wrap things up right after this. Is it finally time to upgrade your home's interior? How about with an authentic farm table made locally from recycled barnwood? Shenandoah Primitives, based right here in Winchester, Virginia, makes farm tables, benches, tables, coffee tables, and a long list of other items for your home decorating needs. At Shenandoah Primitives, function and style are combined for great furniture that will last generations. If you're interested in combining the industrial look of metal with wood, or considering something incredibly unique with a live edge, Shenandoah Primitives turns those ideas into reality. Thinking about a mirror, wine rack, or other accent piece for your home, Shenandoah Primitives can assist with that as well. As a local small business, Shenandoah Primitives is happy to work with each client for a custom design or schedule an appointment to come out and view current inventory. Local, high-quality, handmade items can be found at Shenandoah Primitives. Find us on Facebook and Instagram, or visit us at www.shenandoahprimitives.com. Once again, that's www.shenandoahprimitives.com. All right, once again, I'm Josh. That's Dan on the Kirby on Sports podcast, wrapping things up with our final 3 thoughts on the sports that we did not cover. So I'll go first. I want to talk briefly on some trades that happened in the NFL that we did not get a chance to cover. The biggest one, obviously, not really all trades, but 2 pieces of NFL news that we did not cover due to covering the Super Bowl and stuff. But the big blockbuster trade, Matthew Stafford for Jared Goff. I feel like these 2 quarterbacks switching were inevitable. I feel like it just needed to happen for Matthew Stafford at least. And Jared Goff, I mean, a durable quarterback. I mean, his shoulder was banged up in the playoffs. They beat Seattle. And I think this is going to be a good switch for both parties. And I think both of these teams will improve going into next season.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Stafford's situation. He's really had a bad offensive line, and he's been riddled by a lot of injuries in the past. And he goes to a team with a more solidified offensive line, more weapons to choose from. And, you know, in general, I think it works out for both parties, especially for Matt Stafford, because he finally gets a chance to throw to some decent receivers outside of Calvin Johnson. You know, it's a great situation for him because we'll finally be able to see what he looks like with sort of competent coaching, or more steady coaching, I guess I should say, because not every coach has been terrible since Matt Stafford's been there. I always thought Jim Caldwell was a good coach there, all things considered, but they kind of let him go. But anyway, I think for Jared Goff, I think his relationship with Sean McVay had soured. I think that was pretty well known. And in general, he wanted out. So I think that's what makes this a good situation for him, is a chance to start over, start fresh. The Lions aren't the best team. You know, I don't think they're a playoff team next year, of course. I think they're sort of in a rebuilding stage right now. But I think it best fits Jared Goff for those reasons I mentioned. I mean, he wanted to get out of Los Angeles, and he wanted to start over, start fresh, and this gives him a chance to. And who knows, you know, if he has success with the Lions, you know, a lot of people really pointed to Sean McVay for his success. And, obviously, if the quarterback goes elsewhere, like we saw with Brady, of course, that's a bit of a different story in general, then the narrative changes. So I do agree that it's a win-win for both teams. I think as far as a competitive advantage, obviously I'd have to give it to Stafford. I just think the Rams have much more weapons and a more solidified offensive line right now.
My second key, I'll stay in the NFL here. Franchise tags opened up on Tuesday for the NFL. Does Dak Prescott get tagged again? I think that's a high yes, based on his injury for the Cowboys. And, I mean, he was proving himself for a big contract, and that unfortunate ankle injury did not help. And I think this might be Dak Prescott's last chance to prove what he's worth for the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah, I agree. I think they spent a lot of money in this guy, and if after they franchise tag him this year, which I agree with you that they will, he's had so many injuries. He's underperformed at times. I think he's a good quarterback, but really after his first and second year in the league, he's really failed to reach or eclipse those 2 seasons. So I totally agree. I think this is the last chance to impress the always hard to impress Jerry Jones. And I really do believe next year he'll be a free agent because they're not going to re-sign him. They're not going to franchise tag him again. And you know what? I think it's a good situation. I sort of think the Cowboys have kind of a toxic culture in a way with Jerry Jones. I'm not a fan of the way he runs the organization. Is sort of like I mentioned before on this podcast, he has his hands in everything that the team sort of does. He's down on the sidelines. He's kind of obnoxious. Players generally don't like that. So, Dak Prescott's I think he's a good quarterback. Not great in the NFL grand scheme of things, but he could go elsewhere and I think be a decent quarterback. So I kind of want to see if that happens. I suspect it will happen after this season, and I do believe he will be franchise tagged for this last year.
In my last and final point, let's go to NASCAR. The first 2 races of NASCAR. I know a lot of listeners don't hear me talk about NASCAR, but I'm going to tie it back into the Washington football team. Joe Gibbs Racing.
Of course.
I mean, they're looking strong so far.
Yeah.
I mean, the first Daytona race, obviously, get rain and the race doesn't end till 1 a.m., which I thought was crazy. But the second race, they switched it up and they stayed in Daytona. And what it was the Daytona road course, which I thought it was very interesting. I thought there weren't as many caution flags thrown for wrecks since it was a road course. I don't really agree with that, but I mean, obviously they're not going to throw the caution flag on a road course if it doesn't affect the rest of the field. That's my thinking, but I don't know a lot about stock car racing. But Joe Gibbs, Christopher Bell, passed Joey Logano and ended up getting the win for Joe Gibbs Racing. Denny Hamlin came in 3rd place, which was huge this past Sunday. So NASCAR is looking great for Joe Gibbs Racing. A lot of interesting formats in NASCAR as well. I think they're doing a dirt track scenario too, which is going to be very, very, very interesting to see. But NASCAR's kicked off. The Super Bowl of NASCAR is considered the Daytona 500 by most people, and they had 2 races back-to-back at Daytona. So I'm looking forward to seeing what else NASCAR and stock car racing will implement for this season.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I really haven't paid a lot of attention to NASCAR in the last couple years. I think it's got to be difficult for them when they don't have, especially when they don't have in-person attendance, because this isn't the NFL. This isn't, the NBA or Major League Baseball as far as their reach is concerned. They really have a niche market as far as especially Southerners are concerned. So it kind of makes you wonder, will they at some point this year have fans back? I do think they will to some capacity. Obviously, it differs state by state. And then I think going with Joe Gibbs Racing, just the long-term success that Joe Gibbs Racing has had. Of course, you're looking at drivers like Matt Kenseth and Joey Logano, Tony Stewart, Carl Edwards. There's just been a lot of great drivers for Joe Gibbs Racing, and just a long tradition of success at NASCAR. Martin Truex Jr., of course. It's just interesting to me because he really runs the racing team very well, and that's I think what I think impresses me most, Josh, with Joe Gibbs Racing and how he's able to sort of get this talent and cultivate it. And a lot of guys come there later in their careers. You have Kyle Busch, who's currently with Joe Gibbs Racing with the number 18 car, a guy who obviously has had a lot of success in his career. So love him or hate him. So I think that's really all I have to say about NASCAR, just because I haven't followed it as closely as I used to follow it. I think NASCAR has I will say this, I really like what they've done as far as trying to include more diversity with, of course, the events that happened last year now with what's his name, Bubba Wallace.
That was considered, that thing was already there. They determined that, but still obviously an issue of concern that stirred up a lot of news.
Right. And I think they addressed it in the right way. They did the things they had to do, but they've also shown, because I think there's a lot of criticisms after that, even though, like you said, it was already there and all that, and it was made sort of a big deal when there wasn't a big deal to be had, but it certainly didn't look good at first. But anyways, I really like what they've done with that as far as diversity is concerned, and I think that's going to be a big push for them going forward, especially if they want to get younger people interested in the sport of NASCAR. So,
yeah, and you look at Ty Gibbs, Joe Gibbs' 18-year-old grandson, the road course at Daytona, that was his first career race, and he wins the race.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Incredible.
18 years old.
He looked younger than me on the post-race interview.
Well, he is younger than you, if I can count, I would assume.
Usually athletes that are my age or younger, they look older than me, in my opinion. But Ty Gibbs, he looked super young, like not even 18. But hats off to him. That was incredible.
Yeah, excuse me. That's the direction I've really seen NASCAR going. Honestly, is inclusion of more young people in racing. Like we've seen it with Joey Logano. He's the one that comes to mind, 5 or 6 years ago, who was 18, 19 years old and had a great season. That's going to be key for them in the future if they can get some of those young drivers and sort of cultivate them. I think NASCAR is still kind of stuck in the past with guys like the Busch brothers, who have been around for more than 20 years. So I think that's going to be key for them moving forward. How can they continue to cultivate and build young talent and sort of get them to be successful? I think that's going to be a key for them moving forward.
All right, Dan, let's hear your last three.
Oh, I thought you were just picking three.
Do you have any?
I really don't. I think we covered everything I had in mind. Let me see.
Well, I'll throw in one wild card if you want.
I guess spring training is approaching now, so.
Oh yeah, I can't wait to dive into that next week. That's going to be so much fun.
Yeah, we have a special guest coming on, I believe. It's not 100% confirmed, but he should be coming on, and we've heard his voice before, so we're excited about that one for sure.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, I'm. This is going to be an interesting season to see how things are going to turn out. But yeah, if you have something to add with spring training, yeah, go for it.
I'm going to add one more wild card going back to the NFL. Carson Wentz to the Indianapolis Colts.
Really? Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot about that. Why did I forget about that? God.
I mean, the Colts paid next to nothing for Carson Wentz.
Yeah,
I know you think Carson Wentz is washed up and he'll
Oh,
bottom out in Indy. I think Carson has a chance to rejuvenate and get back to the quarterback that he was. And
I disagree.
I mean, well, we're just going to have to agree to disagree, but I think there is a chance. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I think there is a chance that Carson Wentz will do some good in Indianapolis. But for next to nothing and leaving Philadelphia with 31.5K of dead cap in Carson Wentz, with the new NFL cap, the Eagles are $48 million over their cap space.
You mean $31 million?
Yes. I'm sorry, $31 million.
Yeah. So how does that work? I guess his contract just goes against the cap. They have to pay it.
Yeah, they have to pay it, and the Eagles
insane.
with the new NFL salary cap restrictions, they are $48 million over the cap.
Man, they're screwed.
48.
They're screwed for about 3 or 4 years.
And just as an example, the Washington football team, as of right now, they are under about 38 million of the cap. And that's before potentially if you release Alex Smith.
Right.
Or what you do on those positions if you pay Brandon Sheriff or you let Brandon Sheriff go, which I hope not. But
did you see this? So we're going to leave the Carson Wentz story just for a second. Did you see the Alex Smith story today? The little quote he had?
I did not.
He said that essentially Washington didn't want him to come back after his injury. They didn't want him to play again, essentially. Which I totally get.
What was that? Dan Snyder talking?
No, it was Alex Smith. It was a story, and I think it was ESPN. Let me. I got so many.
Is it always Washington that stirs up this kind of drama? I mean,
of course.
Nobody else. Like you never see this with the Baltimore Ravens.
Yeah, it's because we have good ownership. Yeah. It was this afternoon. It's an article in. Looks like it was in.
I can't believe that.
Yeah, it was in GQ.
GQ out of all places too. Gentleman's Quarterly.
Check out the great Grant Paulson on Twitter for that. The screenshots from the article. Several interesting quotes there by Alex Smith about Washington. Yeah, it's still Washington because as long as Dan Snyder owns the team, they are gonna have moments of scandal and moments of idiocy. So I feel bad. I feel bad for Washington fans that have to deal with this guy for so long. They seem like they're going in the right direction, and then they'll have a story break during the offseason or whatever. Or a player like Alex Smith, a guy who's the NFL, comeback player of the year this year, with these quotes in this GQ article. So check that out if you get a chance. Some really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
I really don't have anything else to add. I think we did a good job covering everything I had in mind, and then some.
Yeah.
And,
that was really great. I did not know anything about that, but that's very interesting. I'll have to look into that more. But that about wraps it up on this edition of the Kirby on Sports podcast. After a brief hiatus, a week off, we missed football, but there's a lot of sports left to be covered here on the Kirby on Sports podcast. Dan, as always, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks again for having me, man. I always love coming on the pod and talking sports.
Let's keep it going, sir.
Thanks again.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Of course. Thanks again to Marisa Pilla of the Pilla Talk podcast for coming on the podcast as well. Big thanks to our sponsors, Regroup Building Services, PM Plus Reserves, Shenandoah Primitives, and Carlos Martinez of Chief Graphics. You can check the Kirby on Sports podcast, where all podcasts can be found, anchor.fm/the Kirby on Sports podcast. You can also find the Kirby on Sports podcast on all social media platforms. Until the next time we speak, always remember to create greatness, and we will catch you next time. Peace out.